meeting of the Point of View SCAR Research Seminar, which is supported by a grant from the Point of View Fund. So we were supposed to have Kimberly lead in today, which would have been a delight, but Kimberly unfortunately had to withdraw for very understandable reasons just a couple weeks ago. And so that's the downside, is you don't get Kimberly lead in today. The upside, for me at least, is that it gave me a chance to present. I just put myself in the schedule. I checked in with a couple of people, and I thought, oh hell, I'll just present my own thing that is a complete and utter mess and is midstream, but hopefully interesting to people. So I just put myself on the calendar. So I'm the last presenter this year. I want to try to do this research seminar again next year, but rather than bringing outside speakers, I think what I'd like to do is to alternate outside speakers with Mason students and faculty. So we'll have, Dan 1 week or 1 month, and then have an outside speaker another month, and have Sam another month, and whatever, right? So a good way to get people to get input on their dissertations, on working papers. We could do maybe a panel or a couple panels in front of ISA for people who are going to ISA or perhaps ACR. So they're kind of cool ways in which we could set this up. So look for more news on that for next year, because I really want to hope that the research seminar will become a thing at SCAR. So, okay, so our presenter today is Thomas Flores, who got he obtained, I'm going to speak about myself first. He obtained his PhD at the University of Michigan in 2008 and joined the faculty at SCAR in 2009, where he has been a thorn in everyone's side since. So this is the presentation of new work, as will be clear from the presentation. So this is sort of new work that I'm doing, and so I hope everyone enjoys the presentation. So I'm going to stay seated since we have such a small crowd. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about so this is the three of us. It's a co-authored paper. That's me, obviously. Gabriela Lloyd is a PhD student at a small, insignificant university in Ohio. And Irfan Nurudin is my long-term collaborator as an associate professor at Ohio State. Gabriela is, by the way, everyone should memorize that name, because one day she will be our overlord. Gabby's the clear brains on this project, not Irfan and me. So I just want to make that clear. And special thanks to Charles Martin Shields, who is my RA here at SCAR, who did a big mountain of the coding that goes into this project. So he's been a godsend for us. And so he's obviously another name you should remember, but you probably already do. And Charles can't be here because he's in the middle of teaching section in Fairfax, because he's also my TA. So Charles is working too hard to even be here right now. So presidents of Mexico. Why do we have a picture of 5 presidents of Mexico after 1982? So in 1982, as anyone sort of knows who knows their history reasonably well, 1982 was not a good year to be Mexican. It was not a really good year to be Latin American. In 1982, the Mexican peso had dropped. Mexico had basically said, we can't make our payments anymore, and clearly a very painful time lay ahead for Mexicans in Mexico in 1982. Now, the other thing that was going on in 1982, that was a presidential election year. It just happened to be a presidential election year. And Lopez Portillo, who was the president in 1982, had, as Mexican presidents did at the time, the right to choose the next Mexican president, or to choose the next PRI candidate, who of course would win the election and become the next Mexican president. He had a couple of choices, and the man he chose was Miguel de Madrid, who's at 12 o'clock here. Miguel de Madrid was a lot like presidents of Mexico before him. He had worked with the PRI for a long time. He had joined the party straight out of college. But he was unlike previous Mexican presidents in that he had a degree from Harvard University. No Mexican president had a degree from abroad for quite a long while. Nearly every Mexican president had a degree from UNAM, which is one of the best universities in Latin America by no doubt, but hadn't had a degree from an American university. He had a master's in public policy from Harvard University and was chosen, and this is true from Lopez Portillo's memoirs, he chose Miguel de Madrid to be the next candidate of the PRI because he had expertise in economics and finance. Miguel de Madrid was followed by Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who got his PhD in economics at Yale. He was succeeded by Ernesto Cedillo, who got, Salinas de Gortari had his PhD in economics from Harvard. Cedillo had his PhD in economics from Yale. Vicente Fox was the first non-PRI president of Mexico, obviously, for decades since the PRI had come into power, but he continued to trend. He had an MBA from Harvard. And Felipe Calderon, just left office at the end of last year, had his master's in public administration from Harvard as well, the Kennedy School. Each of these presidents had this one thing in common. No Mexican president had a degree from abroad before 1982. After 1982, they all have. And I think there's a reason for that, that I'll sort of be going into in a little bit more detail. But sort of the other sort of thing that's interesting in how this coincides is that after 1982, the Mexican economy becomes neoliberalized. Each of these presidents privatized industries, made a bunch of reforms to the management of the peso that are all could be broadly described as being consistent with a more neoliberal model of economic governance. So I don't think those things are disconnected, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And it's not just Mexico, right? This happens in lots of different places. We can take 4 cases. Alessandro Tara is the president of Cote d'Ivoire. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. He came to power after a disputed election in which at first then incumbent Laurent Gbagbo had claimed victory. The French intervene on Ouattara's side, and that's notable in many different ways, but one of the ways in which it's notable is that Alassane Ouattara was personal friends with Nicolas Sarkozy. I think their spouses knew each other. And this is Nicolas Sarkozy's first wife. Their spouses knew each other, and they were married. Alassane Ouattara was married to his wife by Nicolas Sarkozy's first wife. So crazy. Lucas Papademos took power in Greece in the midst of its financial crisis. He has a PhD in economics. He from Columbia, where he worked with Modigliani, who's one of the big names in macroeconomics in the last few decades. Mario Monti, he's ringing a bell to keep Silvio Berlusconi away, I think. His nickname is El Profesore, right, the professor. He's taught all over, but I think he has done most of his teaching at the University of Turin. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is best known for being the president of Liberia and for winning the Nobel Prize, but she has a degree from the Kennedy School. At Harvard, she worked at the World Bank and Citigroup before she became president of Liberia. So it's not just Mexico, right? We think this is a broader pattern in international politics today. The choice of an election, in many cases in democracies, of technocratically qualified presidents and prime ministers. And so this is a larger project that hopefully is sort of my next book, I guess, after the book that I'm working on now that should be sent out this summer. But we're getting an early start here. We want to try to understand the politics of technocratic leadership. But the little bite that we take in this paper is to understand whether technocratic leadership helps countries get IMF loans. Because we think they do. And we'll sort of go into a little bit more detail as to why we think we do in just a little bit. Okay, so there have been sort of several different sources of national advantage in international finance. So the political economy literature spends a lot of time thinking about why do some countries get better credit ratings than other countries, or why do some countries more likely get an IMF loan or World Bank funding, why do some countries have an easier time with the IMF than others. And there have been 3 major explanations for it. The first is economic, and is as oftentimes as might be expected, is informed by the economists. They argue that the IMF is a lot more likely to lend to countries that have the sorts of policies that are consistent with the IMF's policy preferences. Countries that are managing their inflation better, that have an independent central bank, countries that have basically put into action economic policies that the IMF prefers. A second sort of set of explanations is from political science, again, unsurprisingly, and says, well, actually, yeah, the policies matter, but actually the IMF has a preference for democratic governance. There are a lot of reasons for why the IMF might do so, despite the fact that the IMF itself has a sort of very anti-democratic governance structure. But the IMF actually, in the end, likes democratic countries. Democratic countries find it harder to change their policies wildly. A dictator with absolute power can do so relatively quickly. A democracy, the wheels of policy making move more slowly. There are checks on the executive. There are judges and legislatures that can rein in executives in ways that make all else equal democratic countries easier to lend to. There's been a lot of literature on this sort of stuff, basically making the argument that if you take Moody's or S&P and ask them and sort of separate their ratings, all else equal, they rate the democracies better. They rate the democracies higher. And then there's a strategic argument, which also shouldn't be surprising, Jim Greenland makes this argument, and he's a political scientist at Georgetown University. Axel Dreyer has made this argument. There's a whole set of people sort of made this argument that essentially what the IMF is an arm of the United States foreign policy and Western foreign policy more generally. The United States has, I think, 17 or 18% of the votes on the IMF. For certain decisions with the IMF, you need 85% of the votes. So you can all do arithmetic. What that means is that the United States has a virtual veto on some decisions by the IMF. There's been a number of studies here, but one of them, and one of the more recent ones, basically states that countries that are temporarily members of the UN Security Council more likely get IMF and World Bank loans. And so basically what this says is that the United States uses the IMF to reward its allies in however it's defining those. So three big explanations for why the IMF might be lending to certain places and not others, right? Democracy, economic structures, and strategic interests. And all these things are essentially structural explanations. Power in one way or another, however conceived. But what about leadership, right? The question that Irfan and Gabby and I are interested in is, what about leadership, right? Is there something about who is in power at a particular time that makes it more or less likely for the IMF to want to lend to them? And that's sort of a new realm of literature that people are only just starting to think about. And there's now a new literature on leadership in political economy. So there's a longer sort of longer literature that basically says that educated leaders are better governors. That is, when you have a more educated leader, they have longer periods of good economic growth afterwards. There's another sort of argument that says, actually, though, that when you have economists come to power, they tend to liberalize the economy. So the second you have an economist in power, you tend to see state-owned industries privatized, for example. The overall budget decreased, right? So you tend to see sort of economists make the kinds of changes to policy that you would expect perhaps economists to make. Another sort of research lately that says that democracies are more likely to bring more educated leaders. And this is something we see in our data too, but we haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. And sort of democracies more likely lead to having a very educated leader in place. You can take the United States most recent election as an example, right? We were choosing between a Harvard-educated lawyer and a guy with clear expertise in economics and financial issues. So more educated leaders in power. There's another argument that crises bring these types of leaders to power. That when you have a crisis, that's when you turn to the economists to try to run the country. And some of the examples I brought up earlier sort of make sense of that light. So what we want to argue and kind of turn to a different question, which is there a technocratic advantage? What we want to understand is, are you more likely to attract international financing when you have a technocratic leader in power? And we think that it does, right? We think that it does help quite a bit. So what makes a technocrat? We're defining a technocrat as someone who has a credible reputation for expertise in matters of the state related to economics, and finance, and public policy. And some leaders have it, and some leaders don't, right? And I think most of the time this is a public reputational issue. And actually Mitt Romney's a great example, right? What did he say all the time, right? I know how to create jobs. I know how the economy works, right? What he was claiming was a special kind of knowledge that Barack Obama clearly lacked, right? About sort of the sorts of knowledge he had, and that will make me a better governor, right? So that's what a technocrat is, and why do we think technocrats might be more likely to attract financing than I? Or a bunch of reasons, right? But the first of which is that they have some credible claim to be a wiser economic steward. It's the Mitt Romney claim. Because I understand these issues, that will make me a better president. It'll make me a better prime minister. I'll be a wiser steward of the economy because I have this expertise. The second, though, I think is about ideological affinity. If you have a degree in economics from the University of Chicago, or from Harvard University, or from Yale University, or from Stanford University, that is a pretty credible signal that you have a particular set of beliefs about how economies work, why economies work, what policies are good, and what policies are bad. When you have that sort of leader in power, it is a credible signal of the ideological commitments of a government to a particular set of policies. And finally, it's about access to a transnational epistemic community. The discussion of epistemic communities, transnational ones, has been in the ether for a very, very long while in regard to human rights. Irfan and Gabby and I would like to argue, actually, that economists transnationally represent exactly that sort of epistemic community. They're a group of people who know each other, who are committed to a certain set of government policies, who went to school at the same places, have worked at the same places, or within each other's social networks. We can think how we, as academics, function. We have circles of people we know. And so we think that economists work in exactly the same way, essentially. That like proponents of human rights, economists work to, they represent this epistemic community. And when you have someone who's now the prime minister of a government who is part of that epistemic community, people at the IMF are going to react very, very favorably because they think of that as being a credible signal of a government's intent. So we also think then, and so we also make an argument though that this is sort of contingent on sort of the government that you have in the first place. And in part sort of the logic about Mexico makes a lot of sense. And Ellen Johnson's Sirleaf in Liberia makes a lot of sense. When you have a fragile set of government institutions that are very, very new, when you have a new constitution that's barely been written, when you have a state that is generally, or at points, been thought of as being failing, when you have crisis generally that has sort of shaken the foundations of the state to the core, that means that creates a set of conditions under which no one wants to lend to you. But when you have the technocratic power, that's when that technocratic leadership has a very, very large effect. In other words, when you have a new democracy, when you have a failing state, when you have a post-war state, as in Liberia, right? When you're in the middle of a financial crisis, that's when it's most important to have a technocratic leader, because that's when the signal is the strongest. So if the argument has been that democracies generally do better, that democracies are able to credibly signal their intent better and so on, it's in really new democracies that technocratic signal is going to matter the most. In that that's when people have the most doubts about that country. And that's when leadership, who's the leader at that time, has the biggest role to play. And so that's sort of, so basically have two expectations that are sort of opposed. One is that there's a general technocratic advantage, that all else equal, if you have a technocratic leader in place, you're a lot more likely to get IMF loans. The second is that it's actually mostly in new democracies, that when you have a very, very new fragile democracy in place, you're a lot more likely, the technocratic leader has a very large effect on your probability of getting an IMF loan. So that's sort of the theoretical part of what we've been working on. And what, of course, Gabby and Irfan and I are statisticians. And so we thought, well, how would I could tell lots of interesting stories about Mexico and Colombia. Irfan could tell you all sorts of interesting stories about the leadership of the Congress Party in India. But we wanted to have even more to sort of bite into. So we decided with Gabby and Charles, who particularly led up this effort, to create a new data set on international leaders. We currently have data on 1,461 leaders in 147 countries between 1946 and 2010. I think it's 2010, not 2000. I'm pretty sure it's 2010. It's 08. Yeah, that's it. It's 08, right. So basically what we've done is to go country by country, year by year, and identify the effective head of government, which other data sets have done, so that's useful. So we already usually had a name to go along. And then for every effective head of government, to code a bunch of information about him or her. Where they went to college. Did you go to one of the 8 Ivy League schools in the United States, or Stanford or Chicago? Did you attend one of the prestigious European universities, Cambridge, LSE, Oxford, Sciences Po, and so on? Did you go to one of the top 50 universities in the world? There's a sort of standard list that people use for this sort of thing. So we coded, did you attend one of those universities? Did you live in the United States or Western Europe for any period of time? What's the highest degree that you got? Was that degree in economics, finance, or public policy? Did you have a long experience as a businessman, perhaps, before you came to power? Did you work at any of these places? The major money center banks, we have a list that we checked against. The IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the GATT, or the WTO, any of the regional development banks. Were you at all recognized publicly as a technocrat? So we sort of coded a little bit more liberally there. Did you have a degree in a technocratic field? Did you have a job that only an economist can have? Were you a statistician at a central bank? Right? Even if you didn't have the degree, but you had had a job like that, we sort of count you as a technocrat. So basically, as you can imagine, this is a massive project that's been going on for about a year. And Gabby and Charles have been nose to the grindstone this entire time. So that's the data set that we collected. And so we can sort of show, there we go, okay. So we can show you sort of a little bit of what these data have to tell us. And this is all still, kind of early, but let me sort of show you a little bit of what the data tell us, because there are two big points that we want to make. The first one, this is showing over time, whoa, I was not expecting that at all, sorry, okay. So over time, right, this is the percentage of leaders who, say, were studied abroad, right, who worked at one of the IMF, the World Bank, or a major money center bank, or we would code as being a technocrat. There are a couple sort of quick patterns here that I would show, but let's see if I can actually do this. There we go. Okay, so this is a really quick, this is a line for whether or not you studied abroad. And what this shows, I think, is that after the mid-1980s, we see a drop, right? There's a clear increase in the proportion of world leaders who studied abroad to get their degree, until the mid-1980s when we see this sort of rapid drop. I think that has something to do with the end of the Cold War. I don't know exactly what, but you have a bunch of people who become leaders of countries who don't have that experience. But it rapidly takes that same form that it did before, and that it continues to increase over time since then. 60% of leaders now, roughly, have their degree from a foreign institution. And we think that's sort of an interesting pattern. Let's look at this one too, to sort of bore you a little bit more with data issues. All right, so this is whether or not we code you as a technocrat. And the main thing sort of that would be interesting to show here is basically this proportion doesn't change until the early to mid-1980s. And then we see an increase since then. It used to be that world leaders were only about like 10 to 15%, 12% of world leaders were qualified as a technocrat. Now that proportion is over 20%. So it's roughly doubled in the last 30 years or so. And we think this has something to say about neoliberalism in the world today. That we value these sorts of leaders more as a rule in a lot of different countries than we did only 30 or 40 years ago. Okay, one more view of sort of these data. This is also how educated leaders are. Again, this is sort of over time. And the line I would look at the most, though a lot of them reflect this, is the graduate degree. Right. In 1960, let's say, only about 20% of world leaders had a graduate degree. That proportion in 2000 was 40%. It's dropped back down to about 30%. It's still substantially higher. More leaders over time have been coming to power with a graduate degree somewhere in their resume than did in 1960 or 1970 or 1980. So leaders are more educated than they used to be. Leaders are more likely to have a degree in economics or finance or somehow have a technocratic reputation than they used to. So the next thing we did, I don't want to bore everyone too much, but we replicated a study by Dreyer, Sturm, and Vreeland that was published in 2009. What we did was we measure whether or not a country got an IMF loan in a particular year. And then our main independent variable, obviously, is whether or not the leader of the country in that year had a technocratic background. What we want to try to understand is, do countries that have technocratic leaders, are they more likely to get IMF loan? We have controls for wealth, democracy, and UN Security Council membership. Roughly the three literatures I talked about in the beginning, a control from each of those literatures, essentially. And I can talk about the model if people want to hear more about the economic modeling, which I think that means you, Sam. So what do we find, right? Well, the first thing we found is that there's actually no general technocratic advantage. That is, if we pool all countries, there's no general technocratic advantage. You're not more likely to get an IMF loan if you have a technocrat as your political leader. But there is a new technocratic advantage. In democracies younger than 7 years old, so this would include, we can think of a lot of countries that are sort of younger than 7 years old, right? So countries that are sort of very, very new democracies are having a technocrat as your leader increases the probability that you get an IMF loan by 13 percentage points. So it takes it from like 40% to 53%, I think. And old democracies, there's no effect. So if you're a democracy that's existed for 8 years or more, there's no effect. So there's something about this set of countries that is sort of new democratic countries that have relatively weak embryonic democratic institutions where technocratic leadership really plays a role in whether or not the political class can obtain access to IMF financing. So that's sort of our big findings so far. So just to sort of do a quick, review. So two major findings, right? The technocratic renaissance and a sort of a circumscribed technocratic advantage. Their world leaders in the world today are more educated and they're more likely to have degrees in economics and finance than they ever have before. It's a doubling, right, for many of the things that we care about. So the economists increasingly rule the roost in a lot of the countries that we care about, and a lot of the countries that we study here at SCAR. And secondly, there's a circumscribed technocratic advantage. In new democracies, whether or not you have this sort of leader in place plays a major role in whether or not you get IMF financing. It increases your probability of obtaining a loan by 13%. So I think there's some normative implications here, and I wish Rich were here because I feel like Rich would find this very interesting. But I think there's a number of normative implications here about neoliberalism, right? If we think about, in a sense, we're in an economic ascendant period. If you think about the sort of the zeitgeist is a lot more economic than it used to be. The book Freakonomics became something that we assign in classes that everyone just sort of read. And what did sort of Levitt argue with that book, right? Economists can do anything. We can explain anything. We can explain the crime rate. We can explain dating patterns, and we can explain why people name their children certain things, all from an economic perspective. And I think that is not just a sort of a social phenomenon. I think it's a political phenomenon. More and more, we care about having that sort of leader in leadership positions. And I think there's a clear preference in the halls of the IMF and the World Bank for that type of leader. And that's one way in which this, I think, project is going to be moving forward to do, is to think hard about whether those preferences really do exist in the IMF and how we can find out a little more clearly. And now, those sorts of leaders are much more likely to bring into policy a particular set of preferences that isn't very surprising, right? That they come to power, they're more likely to privatize things, or more likely to get IMF financing, and so on. So what we know about these sorts of leaders is that they have particular types of preferences that should not be very foreign to us. On top of all of that, the neoliberal turn in economic policy making around the world coincides with this trend. So I think those trends are then connected in some way, right? And to take a perfect example, right? Ellen Johnson Sirleaf comes into power, and Liberia's debt is forgiven within 5 to 7 years, I think. It happens very, very quickly. The question is, would that have happened if Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had not been in power? If it had been George Weah, an international soccer star, he had another reputation, but not one as an economist, perhaps, right? If he had come to power, would the international community have done the same thing? Or was it that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was able to go to the people of the Citibank and say, I'm one of you, and I know what I'm doing? Now, what does that say about the nature of leadership that we want in the world today? I think there's some normative implications to this project that we're still just beginning to think through. There's a lot that we want to do with this project as we move forward. Disaggregate different parts of what it is to be a technocrat. Think a little bit about the fact that crises bring to power technocrats and they bring to IMF loans. So that may sort of disturb how we're thinking about the causation in this paper. We have a lot of missing data we're still filling in. Gabby and Charles are more or less probably as we speak still working on filling in for more countries and filling into places where we don't have data yet. And thinking about its impact on different aspects of IPE. What we want to do in the long run is to make this a publicly available resource and make it something that lots of scholars can have access to so we can understand the impact of leadership a little bit more. Finally, what we also want to do, if we can get, this would require external financing, is to find data on ministers of finance and central bank governors. And this would be sort of expanding what we mean by leadership would be very useful. And some people are starting to do this, but they're finding it rough going, and we expect that. But that's another sort of next step for this project in the long run. So, okay, that's it for me. Agnieszka is our discussant today. She sort of generously volunteered to discuss the paper. So thanks, Agnieszka. And then we'll have Agnieszka make her comments, and then people can ask questions of her or me.